it gets a little bit more interesting in the sense that in the Sumerian version, it's attached to a much longer script called the Enuma Elish, which goes into describing not only why there was a great flood, possibly because there's this other planet that passes by us, but also because of the fact that it describes our cosmology in a much more intricate way than you have in the Bible. The idea that, God created the earth in 7 days and these things. The Sumerian version has 7 tablets of creation, where this tale is not truncated like the English version and gives you a much more elongated version of the information. They even have things like this where, again, there was, in the Bible it says, man once lived amongst their living gods. There were giants upon the earth. Well, it's interesting that the Anunnaki are sometimes, or in Sumerian times, even their kings, are depicted bigger than the people. And this could just be because of their stature, or they were physically bigger. I actually haven't found any evidence of me personally that the Anunnaki, if they did exist, were giants, but probably much larger in stature than us. But where I did find the information interesting is that they talked about where these beings came from. So they depicted these beings, the Anunnaki, and said, everything we know, we learned from them. And they tell us that they came from another planet within our solar system called Nibiru. And the symbol of this planet, Nibiru, was a glowing cross. Now, keep in mind that this is, 4,000 years before the time of Jesus on the cross. The Sumerians, just to put it into context, 3800 BC, we're at 2012 now, basically 2,000 years removed from the time of Jesus. BC to AD, excuse me. So if you go back another 2,000 years from that, you're at the God of Abraham, the Jewish God. Go back another 2,000 years, you're at the time of the Sumerians. So what's really interesting about their astronomical information is that they knew things beyond their time. Now, maybe not in the context of a cyclical knowledge, but at 3800 BC, they're depicting, here's a man being taken up and being granted the modern plow, the invention of modern agriculture. But as a backdrop, we see the sun in the center and all the planets in their correct sizes around the sun. And even something that looks like what could be a rocket, like we have today on its 2 pillars as they fall off and thing jets up into space. I'm not saying that that's what that is, but we can clearly decide that that's a solar system. So to have that information, way before the time of Copernicus and Galileo and the invention of the telescope, combining that with mathematics, the Sumerians were accurately depicting our solar system, 6,000 years ago. Now, what's also very interesting about that is that they said we lived on the 7th planet. You would think that it would be like the 3rd planet or the 3rd rock from the sun, like the cool TV show. But actually, if you're coming from outside our solar system in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th planet, the 7 days in a week, the sacred number 7, they called Earth the 7th planet. But in their depiction of the solar system, they included one other planet, which they called Nibiru, and we just have not located this planet yet. Modern science has been looking for something that would fit this ancient model, and they call it Planet X. X meaning 10, beyond Pluto, also unknown. And this is just an artist's rendition of the Sumerian understanding. They counted 12 planets. They counted the 9 we know of, plus our sun, our moon, and then this additional planet, Nibiru. Now, what's really interesting about the tale of Nibiru, coming out again from the research of Zecharia Sitchin, Zecharia Sitchin is one of those linguists too that has really suffered a lot of scrutiny because, there's pretty much modern linguistics and academia has drawn a line in the dirt, and no one is willing to step over that to say that extraterrestrials exist. So in the context of Zecharia Sitchin's work, if anyone's open-minded enough to look at that line and choose to just step over it briefly and look at the information, we see that the context of what Zecharia Sitchin says spans beyond just the Sumerian culture and similarities how ancient cultures have all kind of embraced this idea. One of the things that's very interesting about the Sumerian writings is this idea of Nibiru's initial interaction with our solar system. If the Anunnaki live on this planet, the information says that a long time ago, when our planets hadn't even finished coalescing, meaning as the Sumerian Enuma Elish writes it, they were still soft, the planets were still soft. An intruder planet comes in, gets attracted by the gravitational pull of our outer planets, and then on one of its passes, the main moon of Nibiru, or Planet X, has a collision with our primitive Earth, then called Tiamat. That collision causes our Earth to move slightly over into the orbit it's now in, and causes the asteroid belt to strew out which the Bible calls the hammered out bracelet, into the position that it's now in. If we were ever to have some type of a large event like a moon or something whacking our planet, we're talking about a very large event. And if Earth suffered such a dramatic event, it would just be half a planet. How is this possible? Well, that actually fits with our cosmological record in the sense that we all understand Pangea. At one point, we were just one land mass, and like the skin of an apple, it's kind of moved into the places that we are at now. But anyone can look at our globe and see that, oh yeah, they all kind of fit together. The land mass was actually one continent, kind of fitting, again, with the Sumerian cosmology. It's just very interesting pieces of information to come out of this. But the Sumerians say that Planet X goes on, or Nibiru goes on to have this long 3,600-year orbit. It only passes around our inner solar system every 3,600 years. So this is where, again, I started to look for modern information to collaborate this ancient evidence. And there are a lot of current astronomers that have been looking for things beyond Pluto, Sedna, Quoar, Xena, and all these things. To me, they're just large ice balls. That's just my personal opinion. Nibiru, as talked about by the Sumerians, is a planet 4 to 8 times the size of Earth, a very large planet. Something of that size, our amateur astronomers have always been very astute at seeing things before the professional community. Hale-Bopp, Shoemaker-Levy 9, these were all escalated to the professional community, discovered by amateurs. So anything 4 to 8 times the size of Earth, we're going to see it. Now, Zecharia Sitchin, here's the gentleman that did that 50 years of research looking into the Sumerian culture. He met with the lead naval astronomer in the late 80s, and his model, Dr. Harrington, had a model that basically explained all the orbital perturbations and weird things, why Uranus is tilted on its side, all the anomalies in our solar system, he could explain by introducing a rogue planet on an elliptical orbit. This is a 3D model, so his is extending up. Zecharia Sitchin and Nibiru, again, an elliptical orbit. In comparing notes, they found a lot of similarities to kind of, again, validate the idea that if there is this other large planet that we discover, maybe we have ancestors on it. And you can see, again, a lot of current research coming out of our recent news. A mystery revolves around the sun. Pluto has a far-out peer. Is there a 10th planet? So a lot of these questions are now being answered by new technology we have in space. Spitzer, which was recently named Certif, or I'm sorry, I think it was Certif, and they renamed it to Spitzer, an astronomer that just passed away recently. This is one of the best telescopes that we have in space now. What's really interesting about it is that it sits in space and it's super cooled, and it's basically able to regulate its temperature to pass through these immense dust clouds in space that Hubble and other telescopes are limited because they can't regulate their temperature and see through these things that they can't view with a visible light. But using infrared, you can see here's the visible light. Look at the amount of data that Certif is able to pick up. These are all little tiny suns with planets around them. And so it's very interesting, again, that the amount of data that we're able to take out of our instrumentation is getting quite vast. And the idea of a planet whacking ours isn't new. Actually, about a year ago, I saw a special on the Discovery Channel called the Orpheus Theory. The Orpheus Theory states how a rogue planet whacks our primitive Earth, and in the process of doing so, the debris coalesced to make our moon. Well, that sounds pretty similar to the Sumerian story, and they're now just kind of rediscovering that. Another thing about the idea of a Planet X or a Nibiru on a large 3,600-year orbit, I don't know if any of you follow the internet, but the term Planet X has kind of been taken out of context that it's going to be the next Wormwood or Armageddon or the Revelations, that in 2012 this Planet X is going to come back again and pass by us and kill us or cause another great flood. I've never been on that camp, and let me just show you a little evidence why. If we understand from the Sumerian Enuma Elish that Nibiru came in when our planets were still soft, that's meaning the beginning of our solar system. We're talking 4.7 billion years ago when our planets were just coalescing. So if Nibiru goes around our sun every 3,600 years, and it's been doing so since 4.7 billion years ago, just doing a simple math, we can see that the orbit of Nibiru divided by 4.7 billion years, Nibiru has already gone around our sun well over 1 million times. It's very possible that every time it passes by three-dimensional space, we could be here, here's the sun, Nibiru could be way over here. There might not be any actual effects, but there is enough room between Mars and Jupiter, where the asteroid belt is, for another large planet to freely be orbiting. So, again, a lot of this stuff really starts to raise questions. A lot of the things that we see on the shows like Ancient Aliens, or some of the researchers like Dr. Schock and others that go to these locations, we start to see evidence of technology being built and architecture that was used where the cutting tools and the technology just kind of defy our logic. A lot of these sites, the stones have been vitrified, simply meaning that the stones were heated to a molten state, and then they, like putty, could do what they want, cut them and shape them and poke holes through them, and then they solidify into stone. How were they able to vitrify stone? And again, we see this evidence of high technology drilling, molded pouring for connected metal, and like Lego blocks so complex that we can't quite understand what they were being used for. But, again, these laser precision drilled holes really starts to raise a lot of questions as to how they were doing this. Ancient Aliens might want to say that, it's given to them by aliens. I don't doubt that could be possible, but I am leaning more towards the idea that, again, with this lost idea of knowledge in high cycles in the Golden Age, who knows what we were capable of? And it almost seems likely, too, that in these high states of our understanding of math and science, our spirituality would probably be willing and able enough to also want to interact with other beings. So, again, a lot of this stuff just raises questions. This is some stones that were transported. Baalbek in Lebanon, there's these huge platforms, and we can see some were left in the quarry site several miles away because they were damaged. And you can see a gentleman standing there in context and how large they are. These are trilithoton stones. They're extremely large. And so what's really interesting is that, again, we have these sites all around the world, as you've been learning here at CPAC, where it's not just the architecture of the stone and the alignments being so precise. It's off-world. I mean, being able to do terrestrial alignments that date back thousands of years, meaning, this one again is showing the Orion constellation being aligned with the three pyramids at Giza at around 10,500 BC. That's, how were they able to do this? Why were they doing it? So it really is interesting to start to look at a lot of these structures, which seem to be all over the earth. And we're now just starting to go, oh, wait a minute. They're all connected. They're all singing some grand orchestra, and we're now starting to finally decipher the notes. So what I've really started to become interested in my own personal research and factor that in, and all the evidence I've been looking at with Ancient Aliens and where we visited, is putting that into the context of a cycle of time. And what's really interesting is that even the Sumerians, and going back to ideas of the Tower of Babel, and here's two different depictions of that even in color, you can see that they're ascending the mountaintop to build a rocket of some kind to ascend into the heavens. What I find interesting about this depiction, there's two suns at the top, not one. Binary orbit depicted. A lot of the ancient cultures have those artifacts, and it does mean something. So, I really think it's interesting when we look at the Great Year, and where I'm starting to become fascinated is trying to understand that if we're, now just starting to ascend into the silver or coming out here, going up higher, does it make more sense that in our higher ages, that's when the interactions with extraterrestrials or dimensional beings or what have you, maybe even time travel, I don't know. It just seems to make more sense that our access to technology, spirituality in these higher realms would also be a time when we would be most open to meeting other people on that plane. And, I got to give credit to Walter. Love this video, The Great Year. It really opened my eyes to understanding that, it's not linear. And the analogy, which I'm stealing from Walter, is that we live such a short time. And the mayfly, it lives 24 hours. And so if it's born on a cloudy day, it will never know wind or sunshine. And I think that's just such a beautiful analogy in the sense that we too, as we're approaching the end of this Mayan calendar and a larger cycle completing, we just don't have any conception of what's going to happen because we live such a short time. But in having faith in what the ancients tell us, hey, there's some cool stuff happening, and we should all be so grateful to be around that hopefully we will start to make discoveries with our sciences, with the telescopes we're deploying, the science packages that we'll have in the next 10, 20 years are going to just be astronomically more advanced than we can even imagine. So I do find it interesting that as we do this precession of the equinox, there is information that the ancients have been very diligently recording and trying to tell us The Egyptians, this one place in Dendera, which I'm going to kind of slide into another topic here, very accurate representations of our sky, but from thousands of years ago. And you can even look at the detail in this, these carvings. It's amazing, the quality. They went to great lengths to convey this information to us. It wasn't graffiti or some made-up tale. This was sacred information. Okay, so I'm going to kind of wrap it up here, and at the end, in just a couple minutes, what I'm going to also do is I brought a couple of experiments to show you, just so you understand there's pieces of technology being discovered all the time. This one is the Antikythera mechanism. It's about 2,000 years old. It's found off the coast of Antikythera near Greece, and what's interesting is that when they cracked it open, it's more complicated. It has more inner workings than a modern-day Swiss watch, and they theorized that it was used for two purposes. As an astronomical, you could plot yourself a path to navigate in the stars, but also astrological, so you could tell, oh, it was born in the sun and the moon aligning, and here's some information about that. So very interesting that they had these devices, and some of them, again, in Egypt, there's a place there called Dendera, and they have these reliefs on the wall where modern Egyptologists say that, oh, well, these are Egyptians holding up a lotus flower. And this is a lotus flower, and these are just simply the aroma of the lotus flower coming out. No, to me this looks like a bulb, and it's even plugged into a power source. That's what it looks like to me. And if we look at all the recesses and tombs and crypts, there's never any evidence of soot on the ceiling of a flame. There's only two theories. They were using copper or bronze to somehow reflect light, or they had some low-level form of a power source, electricity. So when we look at the idea of this bulb, what I've done is I've brought a recreation in a minute here that I'll fire up for you, and if it's okay at the end, you can come up closer and take a few pictures of it. But then I'm always asked, well, if you had the bulb, what's the power source? Well, in that same time frame of around 2500 BC, we found about a dozen of these in the Baghdad area, simply calling this the Baghdad battery. I, on camera for the Discovery Channel and the History Channel, using this one right here, was able to generate 4 volts by just using some orange juice and some grape juice. So as an example, this is just a little 4-volt LED. It's a little bulb powered by 4 volts. Well, if you start to think about a power source and a light, it starts to make sense how it wouldn't have been that complicated for them to combine the two if they had access to both of them. So I think it's really interesting that we look at a lot of these pieces of technology and kind of scratch our heads and try and figure out what they were showing us. I'm going to go ahead and end my presentation there. If any of you are taking notes, there's a couple of things you can jot down of fun stuff that I've put up online or on the internet, tools and things. And I'm going to go ahead and end it here and then ask if we could turn down the house lights for a moment. I'll go ahead and light up the bulb for you. Thank you very much. Let's see how dark we can get the lights for a moment. And I know my screen's not going to help much, but so if you think about the idea that this is a plasma bulb, they explain the cosmological breakdown of the creation of our solar system and explaining how this solar system formed and how this planet became a part of our solar system. They say that when our planets hadn't finished becoming a solid mass, hadn't finished coalescing, so that's probably like 4.7 billion years ago, right, when our solar system was just forming, this intruder planet gets pulled into the inner part of our solar system and then eventually has an interaction with our primitive Earth at the time. And you can see that there's a thing here called North Wind. It's one of the moons of Nibiru, or Planet X, and that's what whacked us and caused this devastating effect to our planet where we literally were cracked in half and Earth got pushed into 2 pieces and the asteroid belt was created, and that other chunk that was left was us. Forgive me 1 second, folks. I'm going to grab some water. Excuse me. So if we think about the idea that Earth, boy, I'm just making a mess here, excuse me. If we think about Earth as only being half a planet, that was more difficult than I thought. That starts to, again, fit into our cosmology that we understand, that at some point, Earth was just one chunk of mass, land, and only the outside skin like an apple, has peeled away where the continents are where they are. But even today, we can see that the continents fit together. At one point, we were just a chunk of land. One landmass, all the other side being water. Well, that's a pretty interesting analogy because that's exactly how the Sumerians describe the creation of our planet. Now, after this initial interaction with our planet that took place thousands and possibly millions of years ago, Planet X goes on to have this very long orbit. And this is where it gets hard for our modern sciences to confirm this information because where is this planet? Can we see it? Can we find it? And that's essentially what's been going on over the last 20 years, is that there has been research to suggest something has been affecting all of the planets in our solar system. And by just including one extrasolar large planet, it explains all the weird things in our solar system, why Uranus is tilted on its side, Pluto and Neptune are dislodged moons of Saturn. All of these things that we can't explain are now starting to come into light through the media, where we're looking beyond Pluto and using all of our space-based telescopes to start to determine, is there another planet a part of our solar system? Unfortunately, in doing that, they demoted Pluto, which I don't agree with, but that's fine. So Zecharia Sitchin, this gentleman that looked into the Sumerian culture and realized they were talking about Nibiru, in the early 80s met with the lead naval astronomer for NASA, Dr. Harrington. And coincidentally, his model for NASA explained that just by including one planet, now you can see his orbit goes in three-dimensional space. So his is going up. Zecharia Sitchin's orbit of Nibiru is on paper, and it's going like that. But you can see both orbital models are this elliptical form of an orbit. So the ancients were basically telling what our science is now confirming, that there's very possibly some other large planet that's attached to our solar system. We haven't been able to confirm that yet, and a lot of questions arise as to if there is this large planet and it loops around our sun, well, what's causing it to loop back? What's out there that it's possibly looping around to come back towards us? And that has raised a lot of questions. But clearly the science suggests that there is another planet out there. And from the ancient astronaut perspective, the Sumerians and various cultures speak of this visitation. So it's just very interesting that we might have the possibility in our lifetime with our own sciences to find other worlds where there is life. And potentially there is a history with that life interacting with our past cultures. Now, the types of telescopes and things that we have available to us are amazing. And this is one of the latest telescopes that we have out there, Certif. It was just renamed to Spitzer after a gentleman that died, a famous astronomer. But you can see here that what this telescope is able to do is use advanced infrared heat signatures, where before the visible range of light we could see is up there. Using infrared, we're now able to see so much more data. All of those little bright spots that you see are suns with possible other worlds around them. So a lot more data that we're able to start to extrapolate from the tools that we have. And to think that, you know, an extrasolar planet, or the idea of this is a weird, far-fetched idea. This was something that just aired on the Discovery Channel recently, where they said, oh, let's come out with a new hypothesis for how the moon was created. I think there was some extrasolar planet, and at some point there was a large collision between this extrasolar planet and our moon, and the debris coalesced and formed our moon. Wow, that sounds eerily similar to what the Sumerians explain in their cosmology of how we got our Earth and our moon. So it's very interesting that some of the, again, the things that are explained by some of these ancient cultures, as our science learns things, it's almost like we're just being retold things that our ancient man already knew, and we're explaining it to us in their own limited understandings of technology. Now, a lot of people have heard this idea of Planet X, and that in the past it could have caused a great flood, and you know, is it going to come back around and it's going to kill us? Or people are taking webcam pictures now thinking they see Planet X. I just want to show a little bit of math to understand that the threat of Planet X is probably very nil. You can see that, again, the solar system's been around for about 4.7 billion years. Nibiru has an orbit of 3,600 years. It only goes around our sun once every 3,600 years. So if we realize that Nibiru has been going around the sun since 4.7 billion years ago, it's, you know, that's roughly 3,600 divided by 4.7 billion. You're looking at over 1 million times Nibiru has completed an orbit around the sun. And not every time it's going to have gravitational effects here on Earth. So I don't really give it a lot of weight that there's a need in things on the internet to be looking for the next apocalypse or wormwood or revelation of, Planet X or Nibiru. I don't think it's that black and white. But what I do think is very interesting is the fact that it seems to be there is a much larger cycle of time that the ancients are aware of, and we're just now starting to scratch our heads and figure this out. The Mayan calendar, 2012, everyone started to get a little taste of that. They're like, oh, there's some important date coming, but I don't really know what it means. Basically, what happens is that all the ancient cultures were aware of a third cycle of time. The first two, you guys will all understand, but they say that there's also a third cycle of time, and it's a very large cycle that lasts 24,000 years. But it's a cycle. It repeats. So as an example, if you think about the fact that, just living here on Earth, the sun is spinning on its axis, and as that happens, we go into day and night, right? As it's spinning around, day and night happens. And when it becomes night, we get tired and sleepy, and you lose consciousness and you go to sleep. And then it becomes bright out and you wake up. Wow, what's going on? Now, that's an astronomical effect. We don't really think about that. But the second effect is as we're going around the sun, seasons change, summer, winter, fall, animals are migrating. That's all because we're simply going around the sun, and that astronomical effect does something to us. The ancients very clearly said that there's a third cycle, but this cycle lasts 24,000 years. So it's very hard for us to get in touch with how it would affect us or what it means. Now, what's really interesting about this cycle is that the ancients seem to have gone to great lengths to track and explain this information. Everyone's aware that we have 12 zodiacal symbols, a breakdown of the heavens into 12 parts. And this is kind of a big calendar, meaning right now we're in the age of Pisces. Ancient man could go out just before sunrise, just as the sun's rising, and whatever constellation the sun is rising against, we are in the age of Pisces. We are in the age of Aquarius. So we're in the age of Pisces for about another 150 years until we go into the age of Aquarius. What's really interesting is the fact that all these ancient cultures seem to be aware of this cycle of time that repeats. This is where it gets really interesting, folks. There seems to be a correlation between this cycle and what its effect is here on Earth. We've heard of the Dark Ages, and you've heard of the Golden Age, right? We go into the Dark Ages and we forget all these things and start playing out like the HBO special Game of Thrones. We come out of the Dark Ages and thousands of years later go into something called the Golden Age. Now, even Plato called this cycle the Great Year. And many ancient cultures recorded astronomical symbols to show that they were aware of this large cycle of time. Excuse me. Even the Egyptians had these symbols that showed astronomical symbols beyond just the constellations that we know of. Here's a better example of this. You can see the colored pieces are known constellations that we are aware of, but there's a lot more data here that we're not even able to interpret yet. So it seems that the ancient cultures went to great lengths to basically build monuments that align to these star constellations as a way to pinpoint where they are in this 24,000-year cycle. Now, many of the ancient monuments from South America to Egypt are all built as astronomical observatories. And some of these pyramids line up so that astronomical things can repeat. There's a famous pyramid in, I believe, Chichen Itza, where the god Kukulkan descends as a light and shadow trick. It looks like a snake coming down, and it's just a sun angle hitting the pyramid perfectly to make this shadow, and that repeats. So some of these pyramids and structures have been built in a way to glorify these alignments. Now, Giza is a great example. We've been able to see that Giza is actually a terrestrial map of the Orion constellation, meaning those 3 stars in the sky with one slightly offset is an exact parallel to what you see on the ground at Giza. In 10,500 BC, at 10,500 BC, the pyramids are perfectly matched in the sky with Orion, and the Sphinx is looking perfectly east into the constellation of Leo, which is a lion. So magically, Someone built a terrestrial alignment so that in 10,500 BC, these align. And it will happen again when that date comes back around. How did they do that? Why did they do that? Now, Egyptologists say the pyramids were built, 2,500 years, something like that. And you think about the fact that these alignments take place at 10,500 BC, you really start to have to wonder, how old are these monuments and what was their real purpose? So here becomes the real kicker of what I'm kind of briefly touching on with you today, is that the reason why we are in this 24,000-year cycle, right now, modern science says it's called the precession of the equinox, and it's because Earth has this wobble, and every 72 years or something of that effect, there's this wobble, and we can track that movement as we're moving through these different constellations over time. But it turns out there's probably a much more simple explanation, in that we are in a binary orbit. Our solar system has two suns. Many ancient cultures seem to also reference the fact that there's two suns. Actually, over 30 cultures in all seem to have knowledge of two suns. And what's interesting about this is, we're orbiting the sun, so we're moving around the sun. But if our sun is actually also moving through space, we're going along for the ride. So if our sun is orbiting another sun, that's another reason to explain our differential change in what we see in the sky, not because of a wobble, but because we're actually moving through space. So the kicker to this is, if we are actually in a binary orbit, there seems to be a correlation between when the suns are at their closest point, we're in the golden age. When the suns are at their farthest point, we're in the dark ages. That must mean something. The light energy or something that's happening when those energy of the suns are at their closest radiates, or happens something here on Earth where we're in the golden age. And it's spoken of a time by ancient Vedic texts and yogi priests that there is a point in our evolution where we're actually able to interpret God when we're in this golden age. We're about 8,000 years before we go into the golden age, so we still got a long ways to go. But as we're coming out of the dark ages now, we're just leaving the bronze age, it almost feels like things are speeding up. Things are changing as far as people's view of our universe and such. So again, a lot of these depictions of two suns, this is new information I think that you'll start to hear more of, with an explanation for why there is a repeating pattern of visitation from beings that we don't seem to have any remembrance of having interaction with aliens or anything like that, because that all happened when we're in the golden age, and now we're way far from that point. As an analogy too, there is an insect called the mayfly. So if we think about a grand cycle that lasts 24,000 years, we can't understand when they say it will have effects on us. Here's a bug that lives 24 hours, right? So if it's born on a day where it's a rainstorm, and another mayfly comes up to him and says, hey, there's rumors I hear that there's like sunshine and breeze and wind. They're like, I never saw any of that. I don't know what you're talking about. So it's very possible that just because we can't see or feel things in our own lifetime, that doesn't exist. And so there's this larger cycle that our humanity is affected by, but it's a very complex topic, and we're now just starting to figure it out. We do have pieces, though, that point to this as being the truth of the answer. A lot of these monuments around the world, again, you ask any engineer how to try and recreate some of these things, we can't. I mean, it's not like they knew something back then that we didn't. It's somehow knowledge that I think we've forgotten. But all around the world, we see these megalithic monuments where there appear to be some type of, knowledge being shown to us, where they were using building techniques and things that we just can't duplicate. A lot of these stones and things seem to have been cut with a laser-like precision. And more interesting is that they are cut like diorite and granite, very hard stones. They are cut in a way where the only way they could have done this is to literally make these rocks into a molten-like state, like putty, and then just to be able to cut stuff out, no problem, and then it hardens back into a stone. That's called vitrification. But how are they able to heat stones to a molten state? Like, no one understands this. But you can see evidence all around the world of them creating perfectly drilled holes or these intricate cutout blocks, some of them weighing thousands and thousands of tons with no way for us to duplicate that now. In Baalbek in Lebanon, we have these perfectly stacked trilithiton stones. 5 miles away, we found the quarry site, and somehow they were taking them from here and taking them 5 miles away to make some type of large platform. How do they do that? We still don't know. So there is a lot of these monuments, there's a lot of this ancient technology that really do raise a lot of questions for us to try and pinpoint what they could have been trying to tell us. And a lot of these artifacts that we find just raise more questions. This one was found in 1901 by some sponge divers off the coast of Antikythera near Greece. And what's really interesting is that this appears to be under radar more complicated than a modern day Swiss watch. Cogs and wheels and interworkings all connected together, and yet this thing's 2,000 years old. Who built it? Well, we don't really know. It could have been someone like Archimedes, a great Greek philosopher, or maybe it's just lost technology. But what is interesting is that we know it was used for two purposes. It was used as an astronomical device and also an astrological device. Astronomical meaning if I was a navigator using coordinates to navigate through the seas, my ship, I could use this device to plot points in the sky and track my course. I could also use it to say, you were born on the 7th day of June. Well, that means that Jupiter and the sun aligns and these certain things are going to happen to you in your lifetime. Very interesting information, but they went to great lengths to devise these intricate types of devices like the Antikythera mechanism. This one is one of my favorites. This is found in Egypt. And in Dendera in Egypt, this is a place where they have some crypts, some underground crypts, and there's these wall reliefs. And one of them is a place where they talk about the light-giving source. Now, Egyptologists say that this is not a light bulb. This is an eggplant or a lotus flower, and this is simply the aroma emanating from the flower, right? Okay, well, that doesn't look like a flower to me. What that looks like, clearly, is some type of a light bulb. You can see it has a filament in the middle. It's even plugged into some type of a device, some type of an energy device. And so, when we looked at this up close, I actually did a working experiment for the show on the History Channel, Ancient Aliens, and it completely functions. Now, back in the day, we used to have UFO reports that were spawned by swamp gas. Sometimes in certain areas where there's a swamp and it's very hot, you'd have little pieces of plasma gas that would ignite by the heat, and you'd see a little ball of light. That was natural luminescence. Well, what's the difference in trapping some of that and then putting a small power current through it to generate phosphorescence, generate light? So we clearly see that they have the evidence of light bulbs. Now, how are they powering something like this? That would be the next question. Well, we found a bunch of batteries as well. This is called the Baghdad battery. And in the same time frame of Egypt, 2,500 years ago or so, we find these small clay-like jars with a copper lining and an iron rod. And when you introduce a weak acidic acid and pour that in there, you are able to generate a positive volt. Now, using just what you see here is my recreated version of the Baghdad battery. I was able to generate 4 volts. And if you figure a 9-volt battery powers a modern-day flashlight, 4 volts from something, oops, excuse me, I'm going the wrong way. 4 volts from something that size, which is about like that large. What if they made some that were like this big, right? Now, one of the things that they say the Baghdad battery was used for, that archaeologists will accept, is that they were electroplating jewelry. They would be able to heat up gold or silver and then spray it over jewelry. Another thing they were using it for, which I think is kind of interesting, is when you would go into a church or some religious place, they'd have these huge statues of the gods or of a god. And what they would do is they would hook up a Baghdad battery to the statue, creating a static charge, a buildup of a static charge. So when you'd come up to the statue and you'd touch it, it'd be like, bzz, you'd be like, oh, Now, that was a really big deal to them, though, right? To us, maybe not. But I think they were also using it for other purposes, like electricity. So, it's a very interesting thing to look at. But really where I think this goes, and I'm going to start to kind of wrap up some of my lecture here and then take some questions. Really where this is going is that what I'm starting to see is a pattern in all of these ancient cultures, all of these ancient monuments seem to be referencing a time that wasn't happening in their lifetime. They're referencing a time that's off our forgotten culture. There seems to be a civilization that existed before written language that used cosmic symbols and things that we're just now starting to become aware of. And the creators of this lost knowledge, let's call them the Atlanteans as a real rough topic. There was some advanced culture that existed here on Earth 10, 15,000 years ago. We don't know who they are, but we're starting to see pieces of who they were. Now, the Sumerians, again, being the oldest civilization we have, left us these statues of what they were depicted as. And several of these figurines look very pious, and they always have their hands folded near their waist. I started to wonder what this meant, why they have their hands folded this way, because a pattern started to emerge. Not only in Sumer, but in all these great locations, even the ones we're just discovering, seem to show this type of being, this slender being with hands folded at the waist. Now, everyone's familiar with Easter Island, right? The Moai heads. But what you might not have known, and see how their hands are at their waist? What you might not have known is these are actual full bodies. A lot of these times when you see Easter Island, they just show you the heads. Many of these have been excavated, and they're full-bodied beings. And again, they have this similar characteristics of hand wrapped at the waist. Now, just recently, in the last decade, quietly, we've been doing an excavation in Turkey in a place called Göbekli Tepe. And interestingly enough, these are stone slabs that are like some type of astronomical outpost. And this is, again, dated to be 10 to 13,000 years ago. What do we find? The same type of creature, the same similar person described as hands wrapped at the waist in very clear detail as well. And I don't know what this means other than I think what we're starting to see is pieces of this lost advanced culture that was influencing all the ones we know of today, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Mayans, the Aztecs. They all seem to have these amazing monuments and knowledge. I think they were being influenced by these guys, this lost culture, this lost race, that as we start to do more and more excavations, we're going to start finding, I think, evidence for this lost type of creature or being that existed here. I'm sure they were human, but we just don't know. And they seem to have possessed very advanced knowledge that the Egyptians and the Mayans all played into this knowledge. That's why we see it coming from all around the world, every culture. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Just give you a nice informational slide for you in that some of the things I've talked about with you here, if you want to jot these things down, you can look them up on the internet, but all of